It would be interesting to. Wait, am I muted? Let me mute my.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to the post-election webinar, What Trump Means for Korea. Please drop in the chat what cities or countries you're joining from in the chat, or I don't know which side it
I've
is.
seen this guy before.
I know some people are
This is not a
hosting
good
some
sign.
watch parties too, so I'm excited for this event. Interpretation is also available if you
think they
click the
did not
interpretation
mute my mic,
button
which
you
I hope
probably
not.
see below.
Can you hear me?
I would like to first thank Korea Peace Now for co-hosting this webinar.
Hopefully my mic is not on.
My name is Haruki Eda, and I've been a member of Noruto since 2014 or so. I'm also an assistant professor of sociology at the University of Colorado, Colorado
All these
Springs.
professors and stuff.
I would like to first
This is
introduce
the elites.
US Out of Korea, our Noruto's US Out of Korea campaign, and sort of provide a little bit of a background context as well. We launched.
Heard that name, Hayden
Yeah.
Smith.
Sorry, can Jackie go over the interpretation
I
before
invited some people here as
in
well.
Korean? Can she announce that in Korean?
Yes, please go ahead, Jackie.
안녕하세요, 여러분. 오늘 웨비나에 참석해 주셔서 감사합니다. 혹시 주로 영어로 웨비나가 되기 때문에 통역이 필요하신 분은 밑에 줌 보시면 지구 심볼이 보이실 거예요. 그 아이콘을 눌러주시면 선택하실 수 있습니다. 그래서 통역이 필요하신 분은 꼭 지구 심볼을 누르셔서 통역을 받으시기 바랍니다.
The way they like to run is only their people get to talk. This is very common.
Thank you, Jackie. All right. So a little bit about our campaign, US Out of Korea campaign, as you see behind me. We launched this campaign this summer to mount a visible opposition to US imperialism on the Korean Peninsula and to educate and activate a broad base of people in the US in support of Korean liberation in a world free of imperialism. And we have four demands. Number one, we demand US out of Korea. Number two, we demand the end to the US and South Korea alliance. Number three, we demand an end to all aggression against North Korea. And finally, we demand an end to the war economy more broadly. Just a little bit more of a historical context. Folks might remember from 2019, pre-pandemic, the huge Trump and Kim summit at Hanoi in Vietnam, how it failed because the United States was so unwilling to lift murderous sanctions against North Korea. Since then, in South Korea in 2022, Yoon Suk-yeol became the president, and it's a very conservative, pro-US and pro-Japanese administration, and it has increased a lot of aggression towards North Korea since then. Under Biden administration, Washington engineered a new war alliance between these countries, United States, Japan, and ROK, South Korea, and with the aim of coordinating military aggression against the DPRK.
They just kicked me out
for no reason. Is North Korea. The number of US and South Korean military exercises has significantly increased, with hundreds of days of war games conducted in Korea annually. And this past summer, these exercises included rehearsing plans for a nuclear strike on the Korean Peninsula. In response, North Korea has ended their policy of peaceful reunification, constitutionally declaring South Korea, particularly its ruling class, as the principal enemy. To set the context for why we are doing this webinar with our guest speakers today, I would like to clarify that our role in this movement is to interpret the truth for the general population. And we hope that this webinar can cut through all the misinformation that is all over our media landscape today. It's really important, we believe, to understand our own history and clarify our role moving forward. And our panelists today bring with them years of experience as organizers and educators. And we're honored to have them join us in this conversation to make sense of our conditions from transnational perspectives.
This KJ No guy looks definitely familiar. In fact, let me look him up.
To think about why we need this webinar today, things we are hoping to achieve. We would like to advance our collective understanding of the rapidly shifting landscape and why we need our US Out of Korea campaign. Because the underlying conditions actually remain the same, right? The United
Yeah,
States continues
Noam
to bring
Chomsky and all this
insecurity to the Korean Peninsula. So for today, we have 4 panelists. They will provide us with remarks, and then we'll move into moderated discussion with some time for questions from the audience. So in the audience, if
he
you have any
Hollywood?
questions, please use the Q&A feature on your
I
Zoom
wonder if he
screen
was
at the
an
bottom to submit your
NHPI
questions,
for
and we'll do
combo.
our
We're about to
best
find out
to
right now.
combine similar questions so that we can take as many ideas as possible.
I do not see him.
First, we have Mr. Kwan-ho Choi to further contextualize the current situation. Kwan-ho Choi is the chair of the New York Action Committee for Sovereign Peaceful Reunification of Korea. He's also a member of the Korean Americans for Progressive Party in Korea, and both of these organizations are co-sponsors of this webinar. I'll hand this to Kwan-ho.
Okay, let's collect this information right here.
Oh, you're muted.
Hi, good evening. I guess my remarks will constitute a sort of introduction for further discussion and then remarks. But let me start by giving you some of the characteristics of Trump presidency as a second term. Trump's second term in his presidency can be characterized as follows. The first, the world has evolved and is not the same as when he left the White House 4 years ago. There are active wars in Ukraine and Middle East. There are heightened military tensions in Taiwan Strait, Korean Peninsula, and South China Sea. There are signs of accelerating decline of US hegemony and the rise of a multipolar world order in a global scale. There are developments for stronger alliances between Russia, North Korea, and China. North Korea, DPRK, announced its completion of nuclear weapons capability. America First policy is based on isolationism, which prioritizes US diplomatic security over global security and peace, purely on economic terms. America First has inherent potential to opt for an intervention when there's a perceived threat to US economic interests. So what does it mean for Korean Peninsula? US strategy of the dominance over Korean Peninsula has been 1. Hostile anti-North Korea policy. 2. Subordinate policy toward South Korea, ROK. As was mentioned, Trump derailed the chance to reach a deal with DPRK for peace in Korean Peninsula in 2019. Biden continued to push DPRK with unprecedented military aggression and provocation toward DPRK, which destabilized the region to the point that the war crisis has reached its highest peak since the Korean War in 1950. Trump, while maximum pressure is on, may try to have dialogue with Kim, but he must realize denuclearization of DPRK will not be on the negotiation table. So these are some of my ending remarks. There are uncertainties and unpredictabilities with Trump's second term, but one must look for the opportunities that would work in our favor. As for me, I have been in this movement for sovereignty, democracy, and reunification of Korea since mid-1980s. I have joined a youth organization called Young Koreans United in US, which was formed in the aftermath of Gwangju People's Uprising. I was able to see and witness how the world evolved and how our movement progressed through the time. Given the current situation and the challenges that we are facing, I fully support U.S. out of Korea campaign initiated by Nodutol. I think it is very timely and extremely valuable politically and strategically. So I guess the ultimate goals for Koreans would be to have normalization of DPRK-US relationship and ending of US subjugation of ROK, which will ensure lasting peace and the reunification of the Korean Peninsula.
Okay.
Oh, you covered that.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much,
Thank
Kwon-ho.
you.
Next up, we have Colleen. Everybody say hello to Colleen. Colleen Moore is the Director of Peace with Justice at the General Board of Church and Society, the social
Those that
justice
are like, hey,
agency
how
of
can
the
you
United
support the
Methodist
Republicans
Church.
or
You
In
must
her
get a lot
position,
of that,
she is
right?
responsible
Yeah, a lot
for
back in
developing
that
and
BLM
managing
time.
the
I think for me, it was
agency's
a lot of those high
legislative
school
and
people. That's
policy
why I really
advocacy
don't keep in
in
touch with
support
most of
of
them
peace
because did I
building,
tell you I go to
conflict
the school?
resolution,
I used to, the high school was New
non-proliferation
Covenant
and
Academy, just down
disarmament,
here in
as well
Vermont
as
and Westmoreland.
multilateralism.
I mean, I don't
Okay.
know about
Pauline
that, but
previously served
I mean,
as
I was just not a
advocacy
big fan of that
director at
environment.
Women
I'm
Cross
not just because it was
PMC
predominantly
and held
Korean, but
roles at Global Zero,
TikToker, right?
Beyond the
And
Bomb,
Sean Lee,
Win Without War,
Republican
and
National
Seas of
Committee.
Peace.
What's your position there? What
Please
will be your
welcome Colleen.
it'll be
position
like a
there?
PR, like
PR
Yeah,
PR.
thank you
field
so
rep,
much,
like
Haruki,
digital organizer.
and thank you so much to Nodotdol and Korea Peace Now Grassroots Network for having me on this webinar. It's so good to see so many familiar faces in the attendees. And so as Haruki said, I work for the General Board of Church and Society, which addresses more than 30 social issues on which the United Methodist Church has claimed a position on, including peace and reconciliation in Korea. So we have a longstanding resolution that was just rewritten and adopted earlier this year at our legislative body called General Conference that grounds our advocacy for a peace agreement, sanctions relief, lifting the travel ban, family reunification, halting military exercises, people-to-people engagement, you name it, so many more issues on Korea. So right now it's such a pivotal time to be talking about the importance of peace on the Korean Peninsula, coming off of 4 years of status quo and very hawkish policies from the Biden administration, who, as we know, kept saying they are willing to talk anytime, anywhere with no preconditions, but also while maintaining crushing sanctions and escalating military exercises. So as we go into the Trump administration, one could hope that President Trump will continue where he left off with Kim Jong-un, where they almost reached a deal. So to look at the way forward, we must first look at the past and look at how past negotiations have failed. So earlier last year, I wrote a piece for the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientist, and I think a link will be dropped in the chat. It's called "The U.S. Must Trade Muscles for Diplomacy to End the North Korean Nuclear Crisis." So in this piece, I dive into the history of negotiations that collapsed, including the six-party talks in 2003, as well as the Hanoi summit in 2019. So it won't be that simple for Trump and Kim to resume their talks. We know that Kim had a huge loss of face at the Hanoi summit. He put so much on the table, and Trump in the end walked away. At Hanoi, the U.S. demanding North Korea's unilateral denuclearization was responsible for ending those talks without a deal. North Korea had offered to dismantle all its nuclear production facilities at Yongbyon in exchange for partial sanctions relief, but continuing to maintain its all-or-nothing stance, the U.S. countered by demanding that North Korea fully dismantle its nuclear weapons program. So, if we trace back the history of negotiations since North Korea's first nuclear test in 2006, the US has continued to insist on North Korea's unilateral and complete denuclearization without first reducing tensions and building trust. Continuing to press North Korea to denuclearize without resolving the underlying contentious relationship is certain to fail because Pyongyang sees their nuclear development as a deterrent from what they perceive as hostility and aggression from the US. So, to even have a chance of not only denuclearization, but also preventing a conflict, the US has to address the root cause of tensions, which is the unresolved Korean War. So you can trace the war as a main point of why negotiations have collapsed in the past. So using these two examples, the first one during the first round of the six-party talks in August 2003 between the US, South Korea, North Korea, China, Japan, and Russia, the US rejected North Korea's calls for normalizing relations and a non-aggression pact. And instead, the US demanded that North Korea completely dismantle its nuclear arsenal before providing diplomatic or other incentives. And to this demand, the North Korea's vice foreign minister at the time, Kim Gae-gwan, responded, and this is a direct quote, "The United States wants North Korea to drop its pants and be naked and humiliated before the US is prepared to improve relations. We are technically at war with the US, and you want us to surrender unconditionally." So you can see how this unresolved war prevented any progress. And another example is during later rounds of the six-party talks, they did finally come to an agreement that Pyongyang would provide a complete and correct declaration of all its nuclear programs by the end of 2007. But once that deadline arrived and the US was like, hey, where's that list of your actual number of nuclear weapons? They responded and said, we're still technically at war with you. It would be inappropriate for us to discuss weapons with an enemy state. And so moving into what we can expect and what's happened over the last 4 years, the Biden administration's policy review did acknowledge that denuclearization should no longer be the main short-term goal. And they did outline more of a step-by-step approach. But in practice, the administration has not done this. And there's a good example of this. There was an example last year for it was Undersecretary for Arms Control Bonnie Jenkins. She made comments that the US was pursuing an arms control and risk reduction approach to North Korea, which seemed to be in line with what they were saying they were doing, but it was immediately rolled back by their press secretary, Ned Price. And he said that US policy remains the complete denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula. So we can see they still have not learned. So we can hope that the Trump administration will take a different approach than both what the Biden administration has done, as well as what ended those talks in Hanoi in 2019. I would encourage the Trump administration to not only offer talks, but to actually accompany them with concrete actions like sanctions relief, like scaling down or completely canceling military exercises to entice North Korea back to the table. And we saw progress during the summits in 2018 and 2019. It resulted in several tension-reducing measures. There was repatriation of soldiers' remains, reunions of families, landmine clearance, North Korea's self-imposed moratorium on nuclear and long-range missile tests. But to ensure that these agreements hold and that we're actually working towards a positive peace, future negotiations should not only focus on denuclearization, but first address the root cause of the security crisis, which is the unresolved war. And only then will North Korea no longer have that perception that the US is an enemy state, that they're at war with, and that they need nuclear weapons to deter that hostility. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Colleen. Next, we have Dehan. Introduce Dehan. Dehan Song is in charge of the contents team for the International Strategy Center. The International Strategy Center is an organization of Korean nationals, foreigners in Korea and abroad, immigrants, intellectuals, students, interpreters, translators, and designers of diverse sexualities and genders. They build a world of dignity beyond US imperialism and capitalism by connecting movements in South Korea and abroad. The International Strategy Center is a part of the No Cold War Collective, which is made up of activists and intellectuals from around the world opposed to the US-driven New Cold War. Dehan is also an associate at the Korea Policy Institute, which provides analysis on US policy towards Korea and developments in Korea. Please welcome Dehan, and I want to also remind myself and other panelists to speak slowly. You.
Thank you for having me here today. Let me start off by stating that contrary to some portrayals of Trump as an isolationist, the Trump administration will be instigating more wars. More specifically, it will intensify its hybrid war with China. The Biden administration's aggressive policies are themselves just a continuation of the first Trump administration. So what role will South Korea's Yoon Suk-yeol administration play in this effort? Simply put, Yoon will continue as an enthusiastic supporter of U.S. military domination regionally and globally, coupling Korea's economic growth to the U.S. war machine. It's important to note that the previous Moon Jae-in administration, despite caving into U.S. pressure to allow the anti-missile THAAD system, a threat to China's counterstrike capability, into South Korea, tried to allay some of China's security concerns through its three no's. No additional deployments of THAAD, no participation in the U.S.-led missile defense network, no involvement in a trilateral military alliance with the U.S. and Japan. In contrast, Yoon declared his intention to make South Korea a global pivotal state, willingly thrusting South Korea deeper into the U.S. regional and global military architecture. First, he reinstated GSOMIA, which Moon had allowed to expire. This integrated and expanded the scope of intelligence sharing between Japan and South Korea, from North Korea missile threats to also cover Russia and China. Secondly, after letting Japan off the hook for its colonial war crimes, Yoon signed the Spirit of Camp David Agreement, institutionalizing trilateral security cooperation, thus laying the foundation for a NATO-like alliance in Asia against China. More specifically, the Camp David Agreement has institutionalized trilateral military exercise and cooperation across all domains, and introduced language and operational guidelines that elevate security cooperation towards a NATO-like common defense, in this case, against the imagined one from China. In addition, Yoon plans to continue arming the U.S. war machine. In fact, one of Yoon's goals is to be the number 4 arms exporter in the world. Leading the charge will be South Korea's conglomerate Hanwha Corporation with its Hanwha Aerospace and Hanwha Ocean subsidiaries. South Korea's arms industry expanded exponentially. Hanwha stocks went up 350% by selling cheaper weapons such as tanks, armored vehicles, and heavy artillery. In addition, by the 2030s, South Korea will produce half of the warships in the US-led RIMPAC, the world's largest biennial multinational naval exercises. Furthermore, Yoon wants to launch South Korea's aerospace industry by helping the US colonize and militarize Earth's low orbit to allow it to control space, the ultimate high ground advantage in war. The US has already started doing this through SpaceX's Starlink and Starshield. Yet, unable to do it alone, the US wants to integrate the satellite infrastructure of allies like South Korea and Japan. To coordinate these efforts, the Yoon administration is hosting a US Space Force. Ultimately, Yoon wants Hanwha Aerospace to become South Korea's SpaceX. Given Trump's approach of peace through greater military strength and Yoon's desire to play a larger role in the US global security architecture, what can we expect? First, it's clear from the Trump administration's 2017 National Security Strategy and the 2018 National Defense Strategy that it wants to achieve military preponderance. Trump's peace through strength rather than through diplomacy and dialogue will escalate tensions while squandering trillions of tax dollars in the war industry. And while Trump wants to bring war production back into the US, it will need weapons and munitions in the meanwhile. This offers short-term economic opportunities for the Yoon administration. Trump has already offered contracting South Korean companies for maintenance, repair, and overhaul services for the US Navy. Given Trump's blatant transactionalism that seeks maximum benefit from all deals, he will ask Yoon to increase South Korea's contributions to stationing US troops in South Korea. This October, Trump stated that he would ask South Korea for $10 billion, 10 times the current amount, to keep troops here. Likely, the final figure will not be so much, but would involve an increase. We must, of course, challenge this demand historically and geopolitically. Historically, it is the US government that laid and nurtured the seeds of division and war in the Korean Peninsula. Beyond that, today the US forces in Korea are stationed not in front of, but behind 50% of South Korea's population. Geopolitically, this new military posture reflects its shift from being a force dedicated to the Korean Peninsula to one deployed across the region. Instead of paying more, South Korea should be charging rent. While no one can say for certain what will happen between the US and North Korea, it's clear that any major breakthrough will be difficult. Not only has the landscape of alliances in the region changed, Trump's last-minute 2019 no deal in Hanoi makes him untrustworthy. Ultimately, since the 1990s, all US administrations have proven undependable in carrying out their promises. Regardless, given Yoon's hardline stance against and strained relations with North Korea, he would contribute little towards any breakthrough between the US and North Korea. The Yoon administration's approval ratings are below 20%. Protests against him are expanding. The protests, which first started with supporters of the Democratic Party, focused on suspicions of corruption against the First Lady and Yoon's excessive use of the presidential veto to stop a special investigation. Now they have expanded as the Korean Confederation of Trade Unions and progressive political parties are fighting against Yoon's repression of unions, his unfulfilled social welfare pledges, and his tax cuts for the wealthy. In dark and urgent moments such as these, we must fight back and draw strength from solidarity between each other's movements. The IAC would like to help build bridges between movements in the US and those in South Korea fighting US military bases, Yoon's militarization, and the colonization and militarization of space. I look forward to building with you. Thank you.
Thank you, Dehan.
KJ might be recognized me. He looks slightly uncomfortable, yeah? What up, KJ? I know I've seen you somewhere before, bro. Fucking... At least I got into the fucking meeting, though.
All right.
I can barely believe it.
Thank you so much. Next, we have KJ. KJ No is a journalist, political analyst, writer, and educator specializing in the geopolitics and political economy of the Asia-Pacific region. He's a member of Veterans for Peace and Pivot to Peace and the co-host of the China Report on the Breakthrough News Network. please welcome
Yeah, he's
KJ.
fucking PSL. Fuck PSL.
Thank you, everybody. It's a great honor and a pleasure to be with you. Jackie, I'm going to apologize, but I'm going to speak quickly. 죄송합니다. This is a picture of Myeongsong Hwanghu, the Empress Myeongsong. She was the last queen of Chosun, Korea. You may or may not know what happened to her. She was a feminist reformer. Essentially, what happened was that she was trying to mediate between the pro-Japanese factions and the pro-Japanese, pro-Chinese factions in Korea. She sent her cousin Min Young-ik to the West. Min Young-ik came back and told her that Korea needed to change. So she was a very, very savvy and skillful reformer, but she ran afoul of the Japanese. As a result, the Japanese created this operation called Operation Fox Hunt on September 26, 1895, and essentially they stabbed her to death. It's also reputed that they raped her, that they gang raped her. They set her on fire with kerosene, and she was only recognized by a bone in her finger. So this was how Korea's relationship with Japan started, and it resulted in colonization, officially starting 1910, but probably from 1895 onwards, after Japan and China fought the Sino-Japanese War, which was over the Korean Peninsula. China was trying to support Korea's right to remain independent. Japan had colonial designs on Korea. And of course, we know what happened during the Japanese colonization, the comfort women, which is not to say that Koreans didn't fight back. There were many courageous women who fought back. Yoon is one of them. We all know or should know Yu Guan-sun, another very, very important independence leader who was tortured and killed in prison. Probably some of you don't know Hyun Mi-ok, but she was also a very important anti-colonial activist. This is a picture of her in 1929 in Moscow at the Lenin School. This is Hyun Mi-ok. In the center here is Park Hun-young, who founded the South Korean Labor Party, which became the Communist Party. And in this corner, you see here a very young Ho Chi Minh. But let's go back a little bit more into the history. This person this is a Korean person, and it was drawn by Rubens. So why was Rubens drawing a Korean man in 1617? And the quick answer to that is that his name was Antonio Correa, Correa for the country, Korea. He was bought by a slave trader called Francesco Carletti. Carletti bought Antonio Correa in Japan because the Japanese were involved in the triangular slave trade. In other words, they were capturing Koreans and Japanese and Chinese and selling them to the Portuguese as slaves. This is actually very, very well established history. So all of this goes back to the basic understanding the Japanese had colonial ambitions. It was a slave empire. And then that came in the 19th and 20th century. It became a massive imperial colonial empire, whereupon Manchukuo or Manchuria was the industrial agricultural machine that powered the Japanese colonial expansion. Some people talk of the Manchurian Passage, similar to the Atlantic Passage. Historians have compared it to slave labor comparable to the Belgian Congo. These were Koreans and Chinese who were conscripted to power Japan's industrial war machine. And it's one of the great horrific historical atrocities of the 20th century. Why do I bring all of this up? All of this ties together because the United States is escalating to war in Asia. South Korea is a very important part of this escalation. South Korea was modeled and run by Japanese by politicians who were Japanese collaborators. Now, this includes Park Chung-hee, this includes Syngman Rhee, this includes most of the conservatives, and you can also see it with Yoon Suk-yeol. Also, we have to understand that this is not something which is just happening over there, it's also happening over here. Because as the United States escalates to war against China, against Asians over there, some of that blows back over here. And then we are subject not only to that hatred, but to that direct violence. You cannot have a wholesale policy of demonizing Asians, demonizing Chinese, demonizing East Asians without some of that trickling down in a retail fashion and blowing back here in the United States. If you prepare to kill people over here, don't be surprised if people over there, don't be surprised if people here get killed. And this is what happened to Cindy Cho. She was pregnant and she was killed. We also remember the Atlanta spa shootings. 6 of them were Korean women.
He will not acknowledge.
So Asians are no longer safe in the United States. We have to ask the question, why? And the fact is, Koreans have never been safe. They've never been safe in their own country. These are images of Gwangju. And the reason why they haven't been safe is they have always been subject to imperial and colonial rule. Gwangju was enabled by the United States. The US had operational control over South Korean troops at the time. The US denies this, but we know that this is actually the fact. And this is a good example. Kim Moo-sung is a South Korean legislator. He's giving Curtis Scaparotti, USFK head, he's giving him a piggyback ride. So South Korea troops are controlled by the United States. And therefore, it creates this incredible moral hazard for the United States to go to war. The US is going to war. We know this because there's extraordinary information warfare. We know that there is extraordinary preparation for war, logistical preparation for war happening right now inside the theater. And we also know that there's constant provocation, both in Korea, in Taiwan, on Taiwan Island, along the Taiwan Strait, in the East China Sea, and in the Philippines. We are very, very close to war. And if war starts, South Korea will be pulled into it. It will be one of the first places where the war starts. That's because South Koreans have always been the first to know, first to go, and the last to know. During the Vietnam War, 340,000 South Korean troops were inducted and fought. After 1972, they outnumbered US troops 2-1 in Vietnam. In December of 2001, there were 500 South Korean officers fighting in Afghanistan. Nobody has revealed this history. I'm just telling it to you right now. But so South Korea is always the first to go and the last to know. And therefore, if war starts, it will be very, very terrible. Everywhere where the US has gone to war, South Korean troops have accompanied.
Did he serve
and
the US
it has been
forces?
at the bidding and the beck and call of the imperialists.
I do want to know, though.
So all I want to say right now is, because we're so close to war, we all have to work together to try and prevent it. As I said
I
once
didn't kill
again,
nobody.
Korea is already
I was never in the
implicated.
armed
It
forces,
has
so I respect people who said it.
3.1 million troops that can
But
be
if someone's
inducted
deep state,
into war at the snap of a
I'd suspect a
finger.
person with military background
And because of
more
that, there's an
than
extraordinary
less.
moral hazard right now. The US likes to use proxies to fight its wars, and it is preparing South Korea for war against China. This is why we have to put our shoulders to the wheel and try and prevent this from happening. One of the first things that we can try to do is try and wrest back operational control from the United States. The US has promised to do this. They haven't done it. They've moved the goalposts. But this is the first and most important thing that we can demand. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you. Jackie, is it okay to move on in terms of interpretation? Okay, thank you. Just want to remind the audience members, if you have questions, please use the Q&A function on the Zoom screen. Next up, we have Kathy. Kathy Che is the co-director of Women Cross DMZ, a global movement of activists mobilizing to end the Korean War, reunite families, and ensure feminist leadership in peace building. She co-coordinates the Korea Peace Now grassroots network, launched in 2019 to organize U.S. communities in calling for demilitarization and lasting peace on the Korean Peninsula. Kathy's writing has been published in such outlets as the Los Angeles Times, Foreign Policy in Focus, Journal of Policy History, and the Asian Pacific American Law Journal. Everybody, please welcome Kathy.
Hello. I'm going to share my screen as well. Okay. So thank you to the organizers of today's program and fellow speakers.
They usually use another
Today
layer.
I'll be focusing on the road
use another
ahead
layer. Look
for
at the other layer.
organizing for
Hold up.
Korea peace under Trump's second administration. So here's some data from an NBC News voter exit poll. You'll see here that the percentage of voters who turned out for Trump increased from 2020 across gender, race, and age lines. And of course, while polling data varies, these numbers show what many of us already knew. One, the Democratic Party and Kamala Harris's campaign failed to capture the nation. And two, we're seeing a rightward shift both in the US and globally. The other speakers have already provided a very excellent analysis, so I'll just give a brief overview of Trump's legacy in Korea, namely just to emphasize that no other US president has had a more wildly unpredictable and extreme relationship with North Korea than Donald Trump. In his first year in office, you'll recall Trump came dangerously close to triggering nuclear war, threatening North Korea with fire and fury. He also instituted the travel ban to North Korea, which divides thousands of Korean American families, constitutes the harshest set of travel restrictions that the US government can apply, and currently only applies to travel to North Korea. 2018, Trump and Kim Jong-un signed the Singapore Declaration to achieve normalization of relations and denuclearization. Following this, North Korea made several concessions that Colleen and others have described, including the self-imposed moratorium on nuclear and long-range missile testing. But Trump maintained the maximum pressure campaign of sanctions, isolation, all of this impeding critical humanitarian aid. Finally, Trump squandered a key opportunity by walking away from the negotiating table in Hanoi after demanding that North Korea hand over its nuclear weapons program without any US concessions or security guarantees. Arguably, this was the most damaging aspect of Trump's legacy with North Korea. But while this episode was singular in how catastrophic it was also represented yet another chapter of the same failed approach that the US has been applying to North Korea for decades: sanctions, deterrence, militarism, demanding unilateral concessions. Not only is this approach ineffective, it is dangerous. In the opening hours of military conflict between the two Koreas, conservative estimates state that tens of thousands of people would immediately die. At Hanoi, Trump adopted the all-or-nothing Libya model championed by then National Security Advisor John Bolton, making unilateral demands of North Korea. In his memoir, Bolton boasted that he convinced Trump to walk away in the 11th hour. This reminds us that we must continue paying attention not only to Trump, who so often steals the limelight, but also to who is influencing Trump. For his part, Biden further eroded relations with the same failed approach, militarization, deterrence strategy, and also this new trilateral alliance with Japan and South Korea. He also annually renewed Trump's travel ban, and none of this abated the increased threat of nuclear conflict. So looking at what we know of Trump's second administration, these are some of the current nominations and appointments, and what can be described perhaps best as a chaotic mix of both establishment hawks, anti-interventionists, or as JJ Suh has said, both MAGA-ists and reformers. We see Marco Rubio for Secretary of State, a notable anti-China hawk. But we also see Alex Wong, who played a key role in the past 2 Trump summits with North Korea and was also a prior deputy special representative for North Korea. We also see Pete Hegseth for Defense Secretary. Pete Hegseth has reportedly spoken favorably in the past about engaging with Kim Jong-un. Throughout the campaign, Trump espoused anti-interventionist beliefs, saying things like, "I will expel warmongers." Pete Hegseth has said we shouldn't be ricocheting around the world and also criticized the Pentagon's hubris. We saw what might appear to be more anti-war rhetoric from them, especially when we compare it to what the Democrats and what Kamala Harris was saying in her campaign, promising to build the world's most lethal military. But we have to remember anti-interventionism or isolationism in the name of America First is not anti-war, it's not diplomacy, it's not pro-peace. Trump, Hegseth, and others of the cabinet do not have the best interests of the Korean people, people of color, working class, let alone immigrants in mind. And we also shouldn't forget that despite similar rhetoric during his 2016 campaign, Trump was no enemy to the military-industrial complex or to defense contractors during his first term. He was a staunch supporter of corporations like Lockheed Martin and approved increased Pentagon budgets every year he was in office. So in the second Trump presidency, we may see another opportunity for engagement, another Hanoi. But if we learned anything from the prior go-around, these moments of engagement mean nothing without sustained political pressure from the grassroots. So how do we, as Korean diaspora and allies, ensure that these opportunities are not squandered? How do we make endless war politically costly? We have to organize, build coalitions, deeply rooted in solidarity, bring new people into the fold, and make clear how we all have a stake in this. As US-based Korean diaspora, we are in a unique position to build bridges and find common cause with other groups struggling against US-backed oppression. We need to change the narrative. The Korean War is not the forgotten war, as it's often referred to. It is central to the US military-industrial complex. It's not only the longest-running overseas war, it gave rise to the modern-day US military-industrial complex. In just 3 years of fighting, from 1950 to 1953, the US quadrupled its military spending, setting itself up to become the world's military police. The Korean War was global. The US-led UN command involved over a dozen countries. Ending the war is also a fight for environmental justice, as the US military is the top greenhouse gas polluter, and the bases in Korea and the joint war drills between US and ROK pollute waterways, destroy villages and ecosystems. All this to say, everyone has a stake in ending the Korean War. The Pentagon budget, now nearly $1 trillion, and they just failed their 7th consecutive audit. And of the federal government workforce, over 70% are employed by the Defense Department. The entire US economy is overly dependent on the military. We must make war less profitable. Between 2016 and 2019, US taxpayers spent over $13 billion to maintain troops in South Korea. How do we address this? We must adopt a diversity of tactics. Legislative advocacy is one tool. In 2019, Korea Peace Now and Women Cross DMZ helped launch the first House resolution calling for a formal end to the Korean War. While previous bills had addressed humanitarian aid or human rights, we never before had a legislative vehicle that addressed the root cause of war, militarism. This legislation stood apart because it's rooted in the political analysis that no amount of militarized escalation or sanctions will work. Ending the state of war is a necessary prerequisite to establishing peace in Korea. We also have to remember that legislative advocacy is not just what happens in congressional offices, which one signs on or not. It's also a tool to bring communities together, engage in political education, and bring in new allies. But of course, we know it's not the only tool. We need narrative change, cultural work, grassroots, direct action. We need new stories and people from all sectors of society to challenge the state-backed narrative of the Korean War as a model of what a US war can achieve, as Condoleezza Rice has put it. So whatever tactic we choose, we should know why we're applying it in this particular moment to this particular struggle. We also have to know what we're organizing against. A few weeks ago, the House passed North Korean Human Rights Reauthorization Act, a bill introduced by Young Kim. This bill is rooted in a failed approach of coercion, escalation, proposing harmful and ineffective policies like expanding US-funded initiatives at the DMZ to use loudspeakers to blast messages into North Korea. The bill also reinforces the US travel ban to North Korea. These measures will increase hostilities and not actually improve human rights. We should know every single Democrat voted for this bill, and the only representatives to vote against were 37 Republicans. Congress also reauthorized Section 702 of FISA, the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act, which allows for mass warrantless spying. During times of geopolitical conflict, Asian Americans have historically been red-baited, targeted as communists. We saw this in the 50s and 60s with the House Un-American Affairs Activities Committee. Today, upwards of 10% of Korean American immigrants are undocumented. They will bear the brunt of Trump's draconian immigration policies. So we must protect and organize with each other, draw linkages to show how harmful foreign policies that escalate militarism and wars in Asia are interlinked with harmful domestic policies like FISA. So to that end, I'm grateful to the organizers of tonight's event for ensuring that we are incorporating Korean and South Korean and US voices. We cannot achieve sustainable solutions without transnational organizing. In the 1970s, when Nixon announced that he would withdraw the then 20,000 US troops from the Korean Peninsula, South Korean actors bribed US members of the US government to revert the decision, continue providing military aid, and espouse positive views of the then South Korean government under military dictator Park Chung-hee. Koreagate, as this history is referred to, shows that even if the highest stakeholders are interested in withdrawing, the transnational right-wing and transnational forces will still interfere. And I'm also showing here a picture from Camp Humphreys taken less than a month ago. Camp Humphreys, as many of you know, is the largest U.S. overseas military base located in Pyeongtaek. And it says, "We Koreans and ROK side celebrate USA President Trump." We know, of course, that that is not reflective of all South Korean opinion. So I don't want to end my presentation on that slide. So going back to earlier images of grassroots power and community, under this next administration, we must build our own stories for where we are. We have to know our local fights, how they connect to US militarism, forever wars, the Korean War. We have to build that shared language, identify common causes, threats, and act in coalition and solidarity and grow our movements. Thank you so much for your time, and please keep in touch.
Thank you, Kathy. For the interpretation.
Go ahead. You ain't doing shit. We're gonna see though. We're gonna see you're gonna answer the question. We're gonna see.
All right, thank you. We have 15 minutes or so for moderated Q&A, and with my privilege as the moderator, I would like to pose one question around the nature of the JACUS, Japan, US, and ROK alliance. And I would love to hear from all the panelists what your thoughts might be around the nature of this alliance between Japan and South Korea. Why is South Korea working with its former colonizer? What kind of shifts in the relationship between these two countries you might have noticed in the past? Where do you see it going in the near future? If you have any thoughts around this dynamic.
I guess
I didn't even see that as a question. Did you?
I just briefly, I guess I would just say that I think there is a lot of pressure from the United States, and for a very long time there was something called there was after World War II, there was a whole system of bilateral treaties that was called the SF system. And that's a SF system of bilateral treaties. The reason why it happened in that way was because after the war, the United States basically wanted to very quickly prop up Japan, and basically switched this policy from being one about like reforming Japan, changing Japan, and instead of doing that, it basically just changed full course, and then just lifted up the Japanese government. It put a lot of the war criminals back in power, which is where the Liberal Democratic Party is born from, from CIA funding. And it did all this, and because of the actions that it did, it was never able to allow some sort of like rectification or a process of correcting the wrongs of colonial Japan, and basically let Japan off the hook. And because of that, there's been historical divisions that were created, uh, in particular between Korea and Japan, between Japan and other countries in the region as well. Um, so the US always depended on this kind of like bilateral architecture, but it's trying to shift towards a multilateral architecture, right? And JACUS is a part of that, right? And one of the things that happened is that the United States put a lot of pressure on the South Korean governments to uh, to normalize, well, I mean, not normalize, but to more deeply integrate between Japan and South Korea, which a lot of the South Korean public opposed because of the legacy of colonialism that Japan never fully came to terms with. So I would say that the nature of it is very dangerous. Uh, it's ultimately part of an attempt to create a missile defense system that will integrate to the United States missile defense system in order to neutralize like China's counterstrike ability, especially within the first island chain, which Japan and South Korea are both a part of. Uh, so yeah, I would say it's very threatening in the region, and I think what that's doing is that it's instigating polarization in the region where North Korea has no choice but to also fall into this block logic with like Russia and with China and whatnot.
Thank you, Dehan. Let's hear from
They're not
KJ
going to
next.
answer my question. You see this? They answered this question. They answered this question. 8:56 p.m., 8:40 p.m. They don't want to answer this question.
The quick answer to the relationship between Korea and Japan is, as Tehan said, South Korea was never properly decolonized from Japanese colonization. In fact,
I'm
it was
shocked they
simply
even let me in
continued
the
as a
meeting.
colony.
I'm
It went
shocked.
from being a Japanese colony to a US colony run by former Japanese colonial collaborators. And this is the erased history of the Korean People's Republic. Korea created its own socialist republic that was built out of committees of resistance and self-governance, and the US essentially destroyed them, declared them illegal.
Thank you.
So just a few more comments about that.
Are they going to answer my question?
Essentially, South Korea's leadership has been a series of Japanese colonial collaborators, except for a few exceptions. And what the US has had traditionally is it has had what it calls a hub and spoke system, whereby you have vassals, Japan, Korea, Taiwan, etc. And the US is the central hub which holds all of these together. As the empire weakens and its control weakens, and starting with the Biden administration, they started to create a series of trilateral alliances. These are JACUS, AUKUS, JAFUS, etc. And these are like these small trilateral alliances that they refer to as minilateral alliances. And what the US wants to do is it wants to stitch all of them together in this large multilateral alliance that is going to be an Asian NATO that it is building up to wage war against China. And so this is a very, very dangerous movement. And the Japanese relationship is key. Essentially, what we saw in the Japanese recolonization, what we saw during the Japanese colonial period is what we can expect moving forward.
Thank you so much, KJ. I appreciate both of your geopolitical and historical analysis. I would like to ask next question directly to Colleen and Kathy about the movement in the US. What do you think everyday people in the US, as well as in South Korea, can do at this time in terms of responding to this situation?
Yeah, thank you so much for that question. So I think the biggest thing that people can do is advocate to your members of Congress for legislation to reduce tension and build peace. So the main legislative vehicle we've had over the last few years is the Peace on the Korean Peninsula Act. In this Congress, it's HR 1369, and it calls for a roadmap to peace, reviewing travel restrictions and establishing liaison offices in the US and in North Korea. And I will say we've had so much success with this legislation. I'll just point out that this Congress, we've seen the biggest number of co-sponsors ever. We're at, I think it's 53 co-sponsors right now, which is really amazing. Like, I think just stopping and celebrating that success we've had of, we've had 4 years of status quo policies, of lack of diplomacy while the hawkish policies continue, and seeing 53 members of Congress on both sides of the aisle expressing support for peace in Korea is really amazing. And it's because of the grassroots movement we're seeing here in the United States. And I'll just say that it is so easy to talk to your representative's office to advocate for legislation like this. We hold an advocacy week every year and definitely encourage people to get involved in that next year because we can help set up meetings, and it is really helpful. And again, it's so easy to talk to congressional staffers in these offices, and we see the direct impact of your advocacy on these members of Congress supporting legislation like this.
Thanks so much, Colleen. I just dropped in the chat an Action Network tool if you feel moved to do something now or just to even learn where your representative stands if you are based in the US. And then this is also a link to join the Create Peace Now Grassroots Network, where you can just get more sustained updates, because we also know it is about talking to electeds and also pushing them, but also a whole wide range of things. And another point I would make, just to add to that,
never
is
gonna let me in this shit again. You know what I mean? Fuck
how
it, I said it, and it's all
connecting
recorded.
your,
Fuck you.
I mean, I'm talking specifically from the US vantage point, but I think it applies wherever you are, is
Go ahead, you don't
connecting
have to
it
answer
to
my
your
question.
local fight.
Alex, I know you've seen this,
So,
Alex.
and as KJ has mentioned,
Alex, I'm
forever
gonna email
wars
you after
come
this,
home to
Alex.
roost. Here in
Hopefully you talk
LA,
to
I
me.
mean,
We're gonna
the
see what's
stat
up.
you mentioned, KJ, of the 300,000 some
Daehan, you probably remember this
Korean
too.
mercenary
And
soldiers sent to
KJ, you ain't gotta be
Vietnam.
an enemy, bro.
Many
But I'm
of
telling you
them
right
came
now, what I'm
to
saying is
LA.
real, man.
Here in
This
1992,
is
the
bigger
LA
than fucking
uprising,
whatever
who
stupid
were
squabble
the
they're
armed
trying to cover up for the
shopkeepers
bullshit. You know what I
that were
mean?
part of
Yo, I'm a
while
real
the city
organizer out
burned.
here.
A
You
lot
told
of
me to
them
fucking
were
you fucking
veterans
stupid, man.
who had served in the Vietnam War. It
We either on the
compounded
same
trauma
team
of
or
2 of
us.
the deadliest
If
U.S.
you've been
wars.
around war, you don't want enemies, bro.
We deal with that here in LA to
You
this
really
day.
don't.
We have the
I'm not
largest
saying we gotta
police
be
force in
friends,
the
but we
United
ain't gotta
States
be.
with a budget of $3 billion.
Don't fucking
We have
silence
also the
me.
highest concentration of
I'll
Koreans
work
outside
without you,
of
but then I have to.
Korea.
You
And
have to
the
understand. If you
history
excluded me,
of the patrol helicopter, the LAPD, that I hear every day flying overhead, and
then
that
right.
also targets Black and brown communities of color here in LA, specifically the LA Sheriff's Department, who pitched the helicopter to them. It was veterans from the Korean War who came back. and said, you should develop the helicopter here. And then those technologies were used to suppress Black insurgency, suppress the 1965 Watts Rebellion. So that's what it's like. Militarism is transnational, and we have very specific stories that we are uniquely situated to tell about how our material conditions are really bound up with each other. And yeah, it's really emphasized. It's storytelling, translating to policy, bringing people in, building the movement, and understanding that we act in solidarity, not because just someone might be worse off, but because our liberations are bound together. And I think those stories are so important, and that history is so important to tell. And advocacy and organizing with the people around you.
Thank you. I think I can pose one more question.
Yeah, what? Go ahead.
It's a question about war prospects.
Go ahead, do it.
What would you say is the likelihood of war at this time, and what can we do about it?
Okay, what was that fucking question? Oh,
How should we prepare mentally, materially, as a community?
My question.
Now let's hear from KJ.
I would say the prospects are very, very high. The dates have been calendared. The United States has said that war will start with China in 2025 or 2027. And before, they always used to use the language that we have to prepare to deter a war. Now they don't say that anymore. They say we are going to war with China by 2027. When I work with young college students who are in the military, very often they miss classes. When they come back, I ask them where they've been. They say, we're preparing to fight China. We're rehearsing war with China. It's very, very real. And at the highest levels of the US elite security state, the discourse right now is that the US needs to prepare for protracted war. It needs to prepare for world war. It needs to shift to an industrial war footing immediately. And it also needs to bring back the draft in some form. They're saying, and these are estimates.
I'm not sure exactly what this guy's saying, right? The draft in some form. Hold up.
I.e. China.
Oh, draft in China? Oh, you mean draft in Korea? Like it's mandatory service. There's no draft. Like you're in, you know what I mean? You alive, you can get your ass in there. That's what it is, right? Anyways, yeah, so, it just doesn't make sense, right? They said there was there's three questions, Pearl, myself, and Julaine Lee. Who's Julaine? I don't see her, right? Yeah? Maybe she's a moderator. Hey, you know what? I'm not even really going to stick around here. Yeah, I'm just going to fucking leave. I want to work with them beyond for organizing, all right? Yeah, we could actually try to talk to candidates, hammer out some agreements, talk about this issue right the fuck now. You know what I mean? They cannot answer the question. They cannot acknowledge. You know, I just want to stay here just to record that they can't talk about it. Let me turn them up again. They should live stream it. They ain't talked about me yet. He definitely can't. Yo, your boss man, you know. Where is the fucking line?
Went AWOL from the war. That's 50 divisions. 50
Yo, I felt the energy change. How about you? This is live. I'm doing this live. You know what I mean?
You cannot win a war. You cannot fight a war if you have 100 divisions that are missing. So war resistance, recruitment resistance is very important. And then I think the other thing which is really important is kind of remember war begins with narrative domination. It begins with manufacturing consent. So you have to resist the lies that are pushing you towards war. If you don't let them have that narrative dominance, then they cannot have that, they cannot manufacture consent for war. And so this is why each one of us has a role to play. You have to think of your mind as a terrain of battle. And right now, the national security state is trying to colonize your mind. So what your job is to prevent your mind from being colonized, and to prevent that from happening, and then to work together with other people. The last thing we have to do is work for the return of operational control to South Korea. It is unheard of that a country should surrender its sovereignty and for 70 years not be able to control its own troops. That is something which is attainable and demandable, and I think it's very, very important for us to do.
Thank you, KJ. Yeah.
Thank you, KJ. I would add, I guess, just to add a few things to what KJ had said. I think like if
Why am I even
wars to
here?
break out, likely it
Why
would
am I
be
even here?
like
I
I
really
was
don't
part of
know.
a I had No Cold War had hosted a panel which
I'm
was
surprised I'm not kicked
trying
out.
to
I am
understand
shocked.
what's happening
How am
here
I
in
still
East
here?
Asia,
Where the
as
fuck
regards
is
to how
Brian?
US is
Go call Brian.
destabilizing the region.
Tell him to fucking come
I
here.
would say that
Fucking
if
Brian. I
war
want to talk to Brian.
is to break out,
What the
it
fuck are
would
you,
somebody
Brian?
had put out an interesting thing, which is that a lot of the tensions that are happening in South China Sea, that that the Philippines and whatever the tensions there would be a much safer
Fucking
way for
PSO.
the
Fuck out of
US
here.
to
I'm not mad at
instigate
socialism. I'm just telling you right
conflict
now.
with China other
Whatever
than
this
like
is, yeah, right.
directly
That's
going
it.
through Taiwan. And of course, Trump is a bit unpredictable. I think he did a
Always
lot of
wrong,
things
but they're
where
not always right.
he he talks about like charging Taiwan more money, but I think Taiwan doesn't really care. It could just pay it. What it cares more is about continuously getting weapons, and as well as I think he changed guidelines where like high-level officials can have visits with with Taiwan. All these things that really like escalate the tensions in the region. So I would say it would be good for people to keep an eye out on those aspects. And I think panels like this, and of course, just like building solidarity and building networks, and we are not strong, but I think when we come together and we build bonds and we build solidarity, we could definitely amplify our strengths and reach. And so, yeah, I welcome spaces like this and with panelists such as these.
Thank you, Dehan. Colleen or Kathy, do you have any thoughts to this question about everyday people responding?
with his campaign.
All I'll add is, yeah, on escalation of war, I mean, I completely agree that I think that is the track we're on, unfortunately, and just want to point out the ballooning Pentagon budget that we've been talking about tonight is, I mean, it's a direct, threat to what we're talking about. It is escalating tensions with China. I'll just say that the House voted to increase the defense budget by $9 billion over last year's budget, and we are reaching $1 trillion for our Pentagon budget in the United States. And it is so centered around this competition and this confrontation with China. So that's all I'll add to that, is that it is a really dangerous situation and it will only continue to get worse.
Does Alex Humbenin, Alex Choi, would you like to say anything as well?
Yeah, I just wanted to add, I'm sure there are many good things were already said. We also kind of gearing toward having people mobilize to the streets so that U.S. intervention in case of any regional conflict, that there will be no U.S. intervention in the Korean Peninsula. And we can probably similar as what happened during the Vietnam, that we also need to build our solidarity with the international solidarity groups so that if and when that happens, we can mobilize people out in the street. Actually, that happened during the Korean War too. It's not that much of publicized, but that's a fact. The people in the New York City, we have some pictures or photos of them. They are out in the street. and they were
Yo,
asking,
yo, I'm
requesting,
dropping all this
demanding
on you now. Yeah,
that the U.S.
you
not
ready
get
to work
involved
together?
in the Korean War. So similar things we should probably plan if we all see that that's something that can happen, which I think is very likely.
How are they whipping us? How are they whipping?
I'll just add to that. I saw there was a question from one of the participants as well about politicians here in the US being beneficiaries of the military-industrial complex and hawkish. How do we bring them into supporting more peace, and how do we measure people's interest in organizing nowadays? And I would say that some politicians are, Colleen and others and different folks who work on Advocacy Week, we think about politicians at different stages of bringing on, and should be supportive to people who need to be named and shamed, and people where the tactics need to be different. So again, like the difference of tactics. I'll also name that we have seen, I know I shared some pretty doom and gloomy pieces of legislation that were recently passed, but we have also seen, Senator Sanders did introduce an amendment to penalize the Pentagon, reduction of, I think it was a 10% of the budget if it had failed another audit. And so there are moments of opportunity within the legislative sphere, and there are potential people that can be moved, and it's around the grassroots power of pushing representatives, using the different tactics depending where they are, getting people voted out, electing in representatives that are more representative of a pro-peace approach. That's all on the table. And then onto the other part of the question of people's interest in organizing nowadays, I think, of course, what we're seeing with the U.S. complicity and backing of the genocide in Gaza, we are understanding that there is a whole new range of people who are activated, people who are realizing that they can no longer be part of a system, a political society that is implicated in this. And so we are seeing a whole, I think to the question of the appetite for organizing, there is a renewed, I don't want to say unprecedented, because, any student of history, nothing is fully unprecedented, but it does feel this way, that we are living through a huge new wave and rush of realization and consciousness around anti-war, ending U.S. militarism, ending U.S.-backed militarized violence, and wars abroad. So I'll just end there.
Thank you so much, everybody. Now, with a little bit of limited time, I would like to combine some of the questions that are emerging in the Q&A, as well as some in the chat, and pose like a 1.5 question, and folks can respond to both or one of them. One aspect that would be interesting to address is the unpopularity of the Yoon administration, and what kind of movements in South Korea you see emerging that we in the US might also build coalitions with. And the point half part of it is like, any other kinds of solidarity, coalition building that is currently already happening, but also where do you see more of these relationship building needing to be made from our organizing efforts?
I guess first I kind of I realized when Kathy said that it's a lot of doom and gloom, and I think it does feel that way. And I just realized that one of the things that were perhaps is not in the picture in the discussion is that the world order is also shifting, right? All of this is not happening because the US is so powerful and preponderant. It's because it's trying to maintain it. So I guess another aspect to introduce that is not all doom and gloom, is that the world, we are both in a time of great crisis, but it is also a very transformative moment where the world order can shift. We can move from a unipolar world to a multipolar world that can actually that can have great effect and great benefit to the majority of the world. Majority of the world in the third world, majority of people in the third world, and majority of people even in the first world, you know? So I think maybe I wanted to add that just to make sure that because it seems a bit of an incomplete picture to just look at just US domination, which I think ultimately at the background of it all is that it is weakening, and because it is weakening, these are the signs that we see of yeah, of a weakening United States imperialism to some degree, right? As regards to like the potential of the anti-Yoon administration protest, I think I don't think we've yet reached the threshold where we're like, okay, this is it's all gonna come tumbling down. I think it's building up. I think if this like the special investigations they have not happened, they're likely to happen. If they do, and if there's extraordinary things that are revealed, then there's a very high chance. But I also think that to some degree, like for example, like the candlelight protests that happened under the Park administration, in many regards, there were certain things that sparked it, right? But in other ways, there has to be a group of people that are already connected, that are already like understanding the issues to be able to also introduce it in the battle of ideas that will happen when that process starts, right? And I think for sure a part of that is definitely militarization, especially Yoon's uh, economic, like his desire to for economic revitalization through like basically like fueling war around the world. I think these things have to be in the picture, and these ideas have to be developed so that they can be thrown in when things start to change and when things start to shift. So, yeah.
Just very briefly about Yun. As I said in the chat, 100,000 people came out on the streets last week protesting Yun. Massive, massive demonstrations. You did not hear a word of it in the Western press, not AP, not AFP, not Reuters, nothing. Complete silence. That tells you that they're not going to support it and they're going to tamp it down. So already South Korea's self-determination is is mystified and obfuscated and repressed by the global powers that are bearing down on Korea. And I remind people that when Park Geun-hye was impeached, just before she was impeached, she had a plan to deploy 5 armored divisions to Seoul to kill off all of the protesters. We would have seen a second Gwangju if it hadn't been for a twist of fate in which the Constitutional Court actually approved the impeachment. If they hadn't, there would have been demonstrations in the streets, and we would have seen another Gwangju. What I am afraid of right now in Korea is that we could see martial law if there is further protest and escalation by the Korean people who are absolutely furious with this Yoon administration. And I think that if that happens, that will be silenced in the Western press. So all of this is a very, very roundabout way of saying we need to hold the Western press to account and make sure that they don't get away with another erasure, as they did with the Border League massacres, as they did with Gwangju, as they have done with most of Korean history.
I'll just comment very briefly on the second part of that question on solidarity coalitions in the Asia Pacific and globally, and especially here in the US, because it will be more important than ever under the next Trump administration. I think it's so important to not only learn from other movements, but work in solidarity with other movements. I've seen some comments in the chat about Cuba, and there's so many parallels between the US blockade of Cuba and the US North Korea relationship. Kathy mentioned Palestine as well. And I think, especially on this legislative advocacy work, it is really important to share intel with each other and, you know, see what kind of targets we have in Congress and how we can work together to move members of Congress. Like someone mentioned in the chat, it's so frustrating, and I totally hear that when politicians don't represent the
Oh my
people's
goodness,
interest.
Colleen.
And following up a little bit on what Kathy was saying of just like narrative change and people power, we have seen so many members of Congress come around to our side of this issue. And I'll just mention a few big gets that we've seen this year because of this people power. There's a Republican member of Congress on Staten Island, Nicole Maliotakis. She had never supported this issue before, but we have a bunch of really amazing activists on Staten Island. And literally for the last 9 years, every year during Advocacy Week, the same people would advocate to her office to support. And she ended up co-sponsoring this year after so many years of advocacy. We also see some other key members like Josh Gottheimer, who's this big like North Korean human rights guy, and Juan Vargas, who's a foreign affairs member. They've also co-sponsored this year. So it really is about our people-powered movement, and that is how we will win. And it's about learning from other movements and working in solidarity.
Thanks, Colleen. I'll just add last that I will re-up this link to folks who may not know their local community, other people who are interested in Korea Peace. KJ mentioned the importance of veterans. We have a large population of veterans who are part of the Korea Peace Now grassroots network. It's a network of people who are, you know, humanitarians, multi-generational Korean Americans. It's a broad-based U.S. and a specifically U.S.-based grassroots network. We meet monthly. We engage in political education. We have a steering committee of volunteer leaders, and the purpose of the network is to organize around an end of the Korean War and to the militarism, and encourage folks to find their political homes, to find their organizations, to organize with the people around them, and also transnationally. And it's all about the sustained effort throughout the years.
Thank you so much. Unfortunately, we are at time to begin concluding today's webinar, and I would like to thank everybody who's on this panel, everybody tuning in today. This is a momentous event for Koreans all over the world to join us, and we're together making meaning of this shift and what all these things means for Korea. And as many of the panelists highlighted, we can get involved in so many different ways, and one of the ways in which many people joining in today can join this movement is to check out our US Out of Korea campaign. Just to quickly remind our 4 demands: 1, US out of Korea; 2, end the US and South Korean alliance; and 3, end all aggression against North Korea; and finally, end the war economy more broadly. So please find the link to this campaign in the chat and check out our ongoing efforts. We have so many things planned upcoming year. And on January 20th, Naruto will be hosting and participating in rallies in solidarity with Palestine, especially in New York City, Los Angeles, and San Francisco with our contingents. And you should be able to find some of these information either in our website as well as social media. We have Twitter, Instagram. And finally, as many of people have been asking, this recording will be available to be shared within a week or so. So thank you for your interest. Let's continue our conversation. But today, thank you everybody for tuning in, and we will formally conclude this webinar. Thank you so much, everybody.
Thank you, Jackie.
Thank you,
Hero
Jackie.
status.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Recording stopped.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.